Welcome to the third webinar on restorative justice, and thank you for the feedback. I'm a little bit more formal today. The topic for the third webinar is on domestic violence, and I've chosen this topic given that now is June 2020. We're all locked at home because of the COVID-19 pandemic, and what the statistics are showing is that domestic violence has gone up dramatically, and that's independently of where we are and which country we are. And domestic violence has been a huge issue, not only because it's a society phenomenon, but because there's not enough tools to deal with domestic violence. So what I'm going to do today, I'm going to split the webinar into three sections. One, I'm going to talk a little bit about domestic violence as a phenomenon. Then I'm going to talk about restorative justice. And then the third part will be about bringing domestic violence and restorative justice together, and whether restorative justice has anything to do with domestic violence, and if anything can be done through the restorative justice method. Then I'm going to finish with an example of how we can use restorative justice for domestic violence cases. If you are finding these webinars useful, please do subscribe to the RJ4All YouTube channel, which is the institute that I founded and direct, and is the institute that owns these videos. And there is a little bell button. Do press it, because that will give you a notification when there is a next webinar. These are all webinars that we're doing to increase awareness around different methodologies, including restorative justice, that you might find useful as a researcher, practitioner, or just as somebody who's just interested in the topic. So just moving on now to the domestic violence phenomenon, and I'm saying phenomenon because it is a society's phenomenon, and it's a failure of our society, and it's very hard actually to find a jurisdiction where domestic violence is actually criminalized or penalized. So it's not an actual crime in itself in most of the jurisdictions that I have looked at. That is debatable whether it is a good thing to penalize and criminalize the phenomenon, and I've written about it. And what I'm going to say today is actually based on a lot of research and evidence and projects that I've been involved in over the last 10 years. I will put a list under this video if you want to go and see the publications and the projects. But basically all these projects, which some of them actually were funded by the European Commission and were done at a European-wide level, have been done in partnership with what we call victims, offenders, but also practitioners of restorative justice and the criminal justice system. So we would get our information from those who are directly affected before we open our mouths and make claims. And domestic violence, let me unpack it a little bit, because the first thing that we think about is a specific form of domestic violence, and that is usually a physical attack, usually against a female, but the actual phenomenon is wider than that. So domestic violence could be against a man against a man, a woman against a woman against a man, or a child against their parents, and parents against their children, and so on. So it's quite broad as a phenomenon, and the other thing that we should be thinking about is not just physical violence, but actually domestic violence happens mostly in the form of psychological abuse, or abusing the relationship and getting financial benefits, or even practices that we might cover under the blanket of culture or faith or religion and beliefs. All those sort of things, if they are perceived by the victim as acts of violence or omissions, because it doesn't always have to be an act. You can just leave a person without help and that could be pursued. It could be perceived as violence in itself, because you're neglecting your duties, let's say, as a parent. So that is another form of domestic violence. But today I want to focus on domestic violence against women, and it falls within the wider framework of gender-based violence and violence against women. There's a lot of information, both research, but also the media and so on gender-based violence. The international community is very interested in the topic and has issued a lot of statements and policies and legislations, and yet here we are not being able to address or root out this phenomenon, which I deeply believe it characterizes as a society. And it is about this wider issue that I keep talking about in this series. Is part of that, which is the power issue, and it is a clear example of where somebody will exert their power onto somebody else, and our society is largely run by males, and that's where females are still struggling to find the equality, gender equality, surprisingly enough, despite progress. And that is not uniform, but it is a society issue across. So that's what we would cover as a phenomenon of domestic violence. And as I said before, most jurisdictions don't actually have legislation for it. So how do they deal with it? Though it would be some sort of an assault with a twist and so on. But the approach that I have, and I would welcome you to think about this. And I'm not an abolitionist, so I'm saying that with respect. And I was a lawyer, so the rule of the law is an important pillar for any democracy, and is the law that makes everybody accountable. Having said that, there are certain actions and phenomena that cannot be rooted out or addressed just by the law. And that is why I want to look at domestic violence as not just a crime issue, but as a society issue. And the failure of society to address the issue of domestic violence with an emphasis on violence against women as an equality matter. And why am I saying that? Because if we are going to address the issue, we cannot put more and more emphasis on the law when we have seen the law being stretched to the limit and still failing to address the problem. We need to look at alternatives, and when people are presenting these alternatives, whether they're called restorative justice advocates or researchers or practitioners, we don't instantly attack them. And I have seen the gender equality movement and feminists attacking the restorative justice movement simply because they are presenting it as a possible avenue for people to use, and that's not a good way to go about addressing the issue. There's not an either or scenario. We're not in a black and white world, we're in a grey world. And if we look at this as a complementary approach and as an approach to a holistic problem, which is not a crime issue but a society issue, then I think we can cover a lot more ground than increasing the penalties and making the laws more complicated and more expensive to process through the police, the prosecution service and the courts. I will put links for you to follow up on this particular topic, and why I think looking at it as a society issue is far more important than just looking at it as a crime. Again, I'm talking from personal research experience, and I'll just give briefly an example of a refugee woman who was being abused by her husband. It was a domestic violence case that was going on for a long time, and she just simply didn't want to report. And that is the main issue with domestic violence, because they have very low rates of reporting. Victims do not want to report, and if you're not reporting, then how are we going to prosecute and how are you going to implement the law? So it kind of creates a vicious circle. And why don't they want to report it? Because it is most of the times their partner is somebody who they're very close to, or just because that power is there and it just doesn't allow them to go through the process of court and prosecution and police, or because they are locked at home and they just have to live with their reality. And as I said, we're now all locked at home. Access to advice and services and charities and the justice system is limited. So how do we go about getting out of this situation and this vicious circle? And she just didn't want to report. And when things got really, really bad, she reached out not to a criminal justice agency but to a community organization, and she just said, I need help, but I don't want to go to the police. Why don't you want to go to the police? Well, if they prosecute my husband, then he'll go back to where we're from. And then here I am with 5 children. What am I going to do on my own? And that's the reality. So how do we help this particular case without really damaging their lives, which is their lives and is their reality? And is there a place for restorative justice? So I'll close the first box and quickly move on to restorative justice. And the second webinar is about how we understand or not understand or define and not define restorative justice. As I said in my second webinar, restorative justice, I looked at it in a much more broad and ambitious perspective, and not in a limited way through a definition, looking at it as a process or as a practice or as an ethos or as a policy or as a theory. I look at it as a way of living, and it's a voluntary action that we can adopt, and will allow us to share our power with the person or the organization or the community that we might have a disagreement with or a conflict. That approach to restorative justice might be problematic in the first instance, especially when you're using it within the criminal justice context or justice context full stop. But as I said in my second webinar, that's when you start defining restorative justice in a much more narrow sense. But we have to start from a much broader perspective, and that is a guide in terms of how we live our lives, whether we're there to impose the power that we have or whether we're there to share it, and with responsibility take the steps for restore the imbalance that we create through our actions. So if restorative justice is that, then I think there might be a space for restoring the balance that domestic violence causes between what now the justice system, criminal justice system, will call victims and offenders. And again, as I said, I am not comfortable using those labels and those terms when I use restorative justice, because the paradigm of restorative justice, in my view, and many have argued against this view, is that it doesn't create victims and offenders. It creates parties in a conflict. It creates people who have an interest to resolve the harm by coming together in some sort of a form of a dialogue and share space safely to resolve that harm. So I'm not comfortable saying victims of domestic violence and offenders of domestic violence, though that might sound harsh and unfair. I would call those parties in conflict within the context and the lenses that I'm using for restorative justice. And if I use those lenses, then there might be a space for that harm, that the act, and put an emphasis on that act and what is behind that act, the attitude and the belief behind that act, that I want to root out and focus on rather than the individual. And that's what restorative justice does. It moves the focus from the individual, punishing them or stigmatizing them or putting them through rehabilitation programs, and actually looking at what has actually happened, why did it happen, and then try and fix that, which creates a much more long-term solution, as opposed to just processing individuals as if, they're sausages and you just process them through the sausage machine of the criminal justice system, coming out most of the times better than they went into. So restorative justice is that broader perspective that could potentially provide an alternative. And here are some examples now where we have looked at from all these different projects that we've carried out. And this can be, and I'm not an advocate of a specific restorative justice practice, because there's a lot of discussions around this, whether it should be, a face-to-face model or an indirect. So indirect will be through letters, for example, or video calls and things like that. And face-to-face will be just action meeting. And then it's all the different types of forms of restorative justice, which is the one-to-one, or then which we call mediation, with the facilitation of an expert mediator, or it would be circles, so interested parties will come around a circle and share the same space and debate how the harm can be addressed. It could be conferences, and they can be scripted or unscripted. It can be sentencing panels and so on. There are many practices, and I'm not advocating for a particular practice, but there are a number of practices that have been implemented, and there is pilots and research on these practices from around the world that give some encouraging results. And I would encourage you to look at those results. And these are the narrow cases, the narrow understandings of restorative justice, not the impact that restorative justice can have on the society level and the cultural level, which is what I'm talking about here. But there are practices, this is what I'm trying to say, that can actually either divert the case from the criminal process or supplement the criminal case, or even when the offender, as the criminal justice system understand them, is in prison or is in probation, they can undergo a restorative justice practice in the form that I just described. So restorative justice, beyond the narrow understanding as a particular practice, but as an ethos, which allows us to share that power, can help rebalance what has happened at home by putting the person who is harming into a process of change. And that process of change is through the deconstruction of the beliefs that lead them to act in the way that they're acting. But to do so, we need to have a holistic approach. And this is where there is this line between what is restorative justice and what is, let's say, therapy or mental health services and psychological support and so on. Well, for me, those lines are not that important. And if we are going to provide restorative justice in the narrow sense, in whatever form, then it must be provided in a holistic way, preparing the victim appropriately, and then once the action of restorative justice has taken place, to continue the continuum of restorative justice through support. And that support is not uniform. It's very individual, and it can be from psychological and so on support, so that the victim, but also the offender, get the holistic services that they need to have the proper solution and resolution to the harm that is affecting both. And you would be surprised that this is one of the harms of the crimes, if you like, that the lines between who's an offender and who's a victim are blurred. And most victims will not actually call themselves victims, or most offenders will call themselves victims. That's usually the case, and that's when the prosecution service gets really difficult time drawing lines between those. And sometimes, obviously, it's obvious, but I would say most of the times it isn't. But what I am talking about within the restorative justice framework, these lines are not important. So that's the kind of restorative justice side of things. Now, how can restorative justice in a practical way help address domestic violence from a kind of gender equality perspective, but also focusing on gender-based violence, specifically against women? Well, I'm doing this webinar for also another reason, which is to support a project that we have been given by the European Commission, RJ4All, to coordinate along with other partners from Europe, looking specifically at capacity building youth workers or educationalists or school teachers, and anyone who works with young people and giving them innovative tools to start addressing the issue of gender-based violence and domestic violence with a particular focus on women. And why is young people important? Because, you know, the evidence is showing that when we are children or teenagers, our personalities have not been formed yet, and they are much more easy to, I'm using this word very carefully, to manipulate in a positive way. And educationalists and youth workers have huge responsibility to support young people that are under their care or they're teaching them, so that they create you know, a life and attitudes and beliefs that are not unacceptable in terms of the ethics and the morality that we all sign up to, and is what I call the human rights culture. And that human rights culture and language is a universal language. It's not about how I see it from a specific religious perspective. Human rights is a global international language that should translate into very simple words such as dignity, respect, equality and fairness, which I believe mean the same to anyone independently of where they come from. So this particular project, which I'm using here as an example, aims to give those tools. So how do we go about giving those tools? And this can be translated for any sort of profession. It doesn't have to be youth workers. It could be anyone. So if you are, let's say, a teacher, then you need to go through training. You need to become a teacher. You sign up to some sort of professional body. You know, there are different other bodies for professionals such as lawyers and so on. And there are some standards, some occupational standards. There's a framework. You need to practice your teachings or your youth work or whatever you're doing with a specific framework, whether it's a legal framework and so on. So we thought that we look at those frameworks, those occupational standards, and within them identify whether there is any gaps that with innovation can be filled, and introduce new elements that these professionals can take while they're taking their trainings and courses, to empower them to use alternative approaches that would make services, youth services, educational services for young people better. So those elements that we're introducing is restorative justice. And we're using evidences, we're talking to youth workers, talking to young people, to understand before we say what sort of elements we're going to put in those occupational standards and those frameworks, which we can look at the national level. So they're national, usually, occupational standards for youth workers, or again, I'm using this as an example. You can expand that in any sort of profession. Then there is the European, let's say, standards, and there are bodies for that, and then international. And by that, I mean you can have them introduced at the legislative level, at the strategic level, at the policy level. It doesn't really matter. But what does matter, and that's what I'm passionate about when I do campaigning and policy, is that those solutions are evidence-based. And evidence-based doesn't mean doing Google and writing things from our head. It means talking to those who are directly affected. So on that note, and because I'm conscious not to make these webinars too long, I will conclude this topic and say keep open-minded when it comes to gender-based violence and domestic violence, and people are proposing non-legislative punitive approaches in the narrow sense, and start thinking, especially if you haven't been a victim or you haven't been involved or caught into this vicious circle of domestic violence, where there are a more holistic approach that changes our being and puts us into a process of pain and reconstruction, a voluntary process of reconstruction and rebuilding ourselves, is a much more I would say better approach to addressing the issue in the long term. Again, thank you for watching this third webinar. The fourth webinar I'm going to cover is again about a very topical and controversial topic, which is the issue of race and power. And as we know, what is happening now in the world is a huge debate again about race inequality and how we address it. And again, the law alone cannot do the job. And I'm going to be bringing the restorative justice debate into the race equality field. Do sign up, as I said, to our channel if you like these webinars. There will be more. Press the bell button if you want to get notifications on when we have a new webinar. We constructed a page just for these webinars, so do visit it to see what sort of other webinars we have. Yeah, stay safe and out of trouble there. Thank you very much.